Benjamin Ziegler was born in Brooklyn at the turn of the 20th century, in a cramped immigrant neighborhood where poverty pressed itself into every brick of the streets and where survival depended less on kindness than on speed, wit, and an instinct for recognizing danger before it arrived. The New York of his childhood was a place where gangs sprouted like weeds between tenements, where pushcarts crowded the streets, and where the police were as overwhelmed as they were outnumbered. The young Benjamin quickly learned that strength alone was insufficient, and that fear, when properly leveraged, could be a form of currency, one far more reliable than the inconsistent wages his father earned pressing clothes for long hours. His restless temperament and sharp instincts placed him early among the boys who roamed the alleys searching for opportunity, and in those alleys he discovered the rules of a future he did not yet fully understand. In that environment, his meeting with Meyer Lansky formed the axis upon which his life turned. Lansky, quiet and analytical, saw in Benjamin something fierce and unrestrained, something that could be wielded with precision if accompanied by a calculating hand. Their partnership emerged naturally, and it evolved into the Bugs and Meyer Mob, a small but exceptionally disciplined organization capable of both strategic thought and sudden violence. As prohibition reshaped the American criminal landscape, illegal alcohol turned petty thieves into businessmen with trucks, routes, distributors, and customers who paid in cash. The syndicates formed around this trade grew rapidly, expanding their influence through protection rackets, hijackings, and a network of relationships that connected Jewish, Italian, and Irish criminals in unprecedented alliances. Benjamin, known soon as Bugsy for his volatile reputation, became a central figure in the syndicate's early operations. By the 1920s and early 1930s, New York crime had evolved from scattered gangs into a proto-corporate empire. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, Ziegler, and others engineered the transition from traditional Sicilian structures to a national network with defined territories and an internal arbitration system known as the Commission. Violence remained a tool, but it became a strategic one no longer driven by emotion. It was shaped by political and economic goals. Bugsy thrived in this world, admired for his ability to intimidate rivals, negotiate advantages, and impose order with the force of his reputation. His handsome appearance and refined tastes made him a favorite presence in upscale clubs, where his influence blended with the glamour of New York nightlife. Police files began to fill with his name, although evidence rarely held witnesses forgot, fled, or reconsidered their willingness to testify. As power consolidated on the East Coast, opportunities expanded westward. Hollywood had become a new frontier of wealth and influence, with unions controlling production schedules, construction, transportation, and studio operations. The syndicate recognized the value of such a domain and needed a representative capable of combining charm with ruthlessness. Bugsy fit this role more perfectly than anyone. His arrival in Los Angeles transformed him into a figure of fascination. He mingled with actors, producers, and socialites who were drawn to his style and mystique. Behind the scenes, he established bookmaking operations, extorted protection payments, and inserted himself into the structure of labor unions. The West Coast rackets grew rapidly under his authority, and his personal life grew equally extravagant, fueled by wealth, fame, and the seductive illusion of untouchability. Yet, with every new venture and every display of luxury, he began drifting from the disciplined, understated methods preferred by Lansky and the East Coast Syndicate. His behavior attracted attention from the press, police, and federal investigators. He fueled rumors and fed jealousy among those who questioned whether his success on the West Coast had made him forget the hierarchy that had elevated him. The psychological tension between his desire for independence and the structured demands of the national syndicate became the underlying current of all his decisions. When he turned his attention to Nevada, he envisioned something unprecedented. A grand casino rising from the emptiness of the desert, a project unlike anything the criminal underworld had attempted. The Flamingo was intended to be an empire, a destination, a mark of permanence in a life often threatened by impermanence. The construction was plagued by financial mismanagement, delays, spiraling budgets, and the challenges of building a luxurious resort in the desert long before Las Vegas had the infrastructure to support such ambition. Bugsy's spending worried the syndicate's financial backers, and his insistence on perfection clashed with their demands for efficiency. His personal charisma could not compensate for the mounting frustration of investors who felt their money was vanishing into a dream too grand to be real. Rumors circulated that he skimmed funds, whether intentionally or through miscalculation, and these rumors eroded the trust he once commanded effortlessly. By the mid-1940s, the syndicate had grown tired of excuses. While Lansky attempted to shield his old friend, The larger organization viewed Bugsy as a liability whose charisma could no longer protect him. The Flamingo opened, closing soon after due to financial disaster, and although it eventually succeeded, it succeeded too late for its creator. On June 20, 1947, in Beverly Hills, Bugsy's life ended in a burst of bullets that shattered the window of the house where he was staying. His death was quick, violent, and symbolically aligned with the world that had shaped him. Decisive, impersonal, and executed with the cold logic of organizational necessity. His legacy survived him, reflected in the transformation of Las Vegas from desert nothingness into a global gambling capital. The Flamingo became more than a casino, it became a monument to reckless vision, a reminder of the thin line between genius and self-destruction. The decades that followed, extending into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, saw American organized crime evolve further, expanding into casinos, unions, narcotics, loan sharking, racketeering, and political infiltration. Yet Bugsy's story remained foundational, representing the moment when the underworld began to think like an empire rather than a street gang. From 1900 to 1984, American criminal history was shaped by men like him, immigrant sons navigating a world fractured by poverty, prejudice, and ambition. They built syndicates, executed rivals, bribed officials, controlled industries, and left a trail of violence intertwined with economic transformation. Bugsy Ziegler stood among them not as the most powerful or the most brutal but as the one who dared to dream beyond the boundaries of the criminal world. His life illustrated the rise of organized crime from urban alleys to national influence and the harsh consequences awaiting those who strayed beyond the invisible limits set by the organizations they helped build. His death closed a chapter, but the myth persisted, interwoven with the history of American gangs across the 20th century and reaching into the final decades before the decline of traditional mob power. As the 1930s advanced, the structure of American criminal power solidified into an intricate network that reached far beyond the boundaries of individual cities, connecting men whose ambitions stretched across states and industries. The aftermath of Prohibition created a vacuum in which newly enriched gangsters sought to repurpose their financial strength into broader enterprises, transforming illegal liquor routes into pathways for narcotics, gambling, extortion, and union infiltration. In this expanding framework, Benjamin Ziegler, shaped by the chaos of New York's underworld and sharpened by the disciplined upbringing he received from his alliance with Meyer Lansky, became an essential figure in the machinery that coordinated violence and profit on a national scale. His reputation for efficiency preceded him, and the calculated violence he employed became both a deterrent and a means of negotiation, reinforcing the authority of the syndicate he helped build. The criminal landscape of the United States no longer resembled the street-bound gangs of the early century, as cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, and Los Angeles developed their own power centers, each tied together through shared interests, transportation routes, and a mutual need to avoid unnecessary conflict. Chicago, under the influence of men who succeeded Al Capone, shifted from volatile street warfare into a more subtle system of political manipulation and business infiltration, its syndicate overseeing gambling dens, horse racing schemes, and union rackets that produced steady income without attracting undue law enforcement scrutiny. Detroit's Purple Gang controlled smuggling routes around the Great Lakes, maintaining a reputation for unpredictable brutality that discouraged rivals. Cleveland's underworld blended Jewish and Italian factions under fragile alliances that depended on constant negotiation. Kansas City became a central hub for Midwestern gambling operations, maintaining connections with Las Vegas long before the Desert City grew into a major enterprise. Each of these domains, while locally governed, remained connected to the broader syndicate whose influence was orchestrated by figures like Lansky, Luciano, and their most trusted enforcers, including Ziegler. The rapid expansion of organized crime was aided by the inability of federal institutions to adapt quickly enough to match criminal innovation. Local police departments were often undermanned, underfunded, or compromised through bribery, while federal agencies lacked modern investigative tools, allowing the syndicates to operate with confidence. Corruption served as a lubricant for business, with politicians, judges, officers, and union leaders accepting payments that ensured the smooth progression of rackets. The criminal organizations of this era were no longer crude collections of violent men but sophisticated, hierarchical entities capable of managing financial portfolios, laundering operations, logistical networks, and international contacts. In this environment, Ziegler's role expanded from that of an enforcer to a liaison whose charm provided access to social and political spaces that had previously been closed to men of his kind. Hollywood, in particular, became a fertile territory for expansion. The film industry generated unprecedented wealth, and its complex labor structure created opportunities for manipulation. Unions controlling projections, lighting, carpentry, transportation, and security became vulnerable points through which the syndicate could extract fees or influence production schedules. Through Ziegler's leadership, Los Angeles evolved into a major criminal outpost where rackets flourished quietly behind the glamour of studios and nightclubs. The entertainment elite, fascinated by his polished appearance and bold confidence, embraced him as a figure of intrigue. He navigated these environments seamlessly, blending criminal authority with social sophistication, a combination that made him invaluable to the syndicate. Yet this same ability that elevated his status also sowed the seeds of future discord, as his lifestyle increasingly diverged from the disciplined, understated operations favored by his East Coast counterparts. The National Syndicate continued to expand its infrastructure throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, branching into gambling operations in Florida, narcotics routes through Cuba, construction companies tied to union rackets, and trucking monopolies that controlled interstate commerce. Meanwhile, law enforcement began to evolve as well, with federal agencies adopting new investigative techniques, establishing task forces, and building intelligence networks intended to dismantle the criminal empires that had flourished for decades. However, the syndicates adapted quickly, shifting their operations and strengthening their internal security protocols. Assassinations were carried out only when strategically necessary, and disputes among factions were settled through arbitration panels that maintained balance and minimized disruption to profitable enterprises. This era marked the height of organized crime sophistication and influence, a period in which its reach extended into everyday life in ways often invisible to the public. Within this increasingly streamlined and strategic environment, Ziegler's influence remained significant but also increasingly precarious. His ventures, fueled by ambition and a desire for recognition beyond the criminal sphere, began to diverge from the syndicate's expectations. His partnerships with Hollywood figures brought money and influence, but also scrutiny. His Western operations grew in size but also unpredictability. The pressure placed upon him by the criminal hierarchy to maintain profitability clashed with his personal desire to build something monumental, something that would endure beyond the shifting alliances of the underworld. This internal conflict shaped the course of his decisions during the period preceding his involvement in the Las Vegas project, a venture that would define both his legacy and his downfall. By the early 1940s, the American underworld had reached a critical point where its empire spanned both coasts and influenced industries ranging from entertainment to transportation. The internal structure was strong, but the ambitions of individual members threatened to destabilize the carefully balanced system. In this environment, Ziegler saw the frontier of Nevada not as a peripheral territory but as an opportunity to create a lasting monument to the power and wealth of the syndicate. The desert represented both danger and possibility, a blank canvas upon which he could inscribe his vision of a glamorous future defined by luxury, entertainment, and perpetual profit. His decision to step into this venture was propelled not only by economic calculation but also by the restless nature that had driven him since childhood, a persistent desire to transcend the limitations imposed by the world he inhabited. As the 1940s progressed, the American criminal landscape shifted once again, shaped by wartime economics, population migrations, and the rapid urbanization that transformed entire regions into markets for illicit business. The syndicate expanded its financial reach by embedding itself within industries that benefited from the wartime boom, capitalizing on construction contracts, shipyard labor, and the movement of military supplies across rail networks. Although the federal government attempted to regulate these industries, the sheer scale of wartime production created gaps that criminal organizations could exploit. The syndicate used these opportunities to strengthen internal hierarchies, launder profits, and establish new connections that would prove essential in the decades to come. This era also marked the emergence of a new generation of criminals who were shaped not by the chaos of prohibition but by the disciplined structures that their predecessors had built. They entered a world in which organized crime functioned with corporate-like efficiency, maintaining influence over unions, transportation, gambling, and emerging narcotics routes that extended beyond national borders. The post-war period witnessed a migration of criminal interests into suburban territories, where law enforcement was fragmented and unprepared for organized infiltration. Newly developed neighborhoods across California, Nevada, New Jersey, and Arizona became ideal environments for criminal enterprises disguised as small businesses, real estate firms, construction companies, and entertainment venues. The syndicate recognized that these regions offered lower scrutiny and higher potential, allowing them to channel profits from East Coast rackets into legitimate-seeming investments. Los Angeles continued to serve as a critical outpost for both financial and social influence, with Ziegler's earlier presence establishing a foundation that others would later expand upon. The city's booming population and entertainment-driven economy provided cover for loan sharking operations, bookmakers, protection rackets, and narcotics distribution networks. Meanwhile, Nevada, still largely undeveloped, represented an opportunity for more ambitious ventures that blended legality with criminal ingenuity. The transformation of Las Vegas into a burgeoning gambling center became a pivotal turning point in the evolution of American organized crime. Although Ziegler's involvement with the Flamingo set the stage for larger developments, the city's growth did not rely solely on his vision. After his death, the syndicate recognized the profitability of regulated gambling and began investing heavily in casinos, hotels, and entertainment complexes. They supplied financing, enforced order, and ensured that profits flowed into the right hands. Over the next several decades, Las Vegas grew from a dusty desert town into a national attraction whose glamorous facade concealed a network of skimming operations, union manipulation, and hidden ownership structures managed by Midwest and East Coast syndicates. These operations allowed criminal groups to make millions in unreported revenue, using the casinos not only as profit centers but also as financial instruments that enabled money laundering on an unprecedented scale. The desert city became a symbol of how deeply organized crime could embed itself into legitimate industries while maintaining operational secrecy. As Las Vegas continued to expand, the American underworld also adapted to new economic realities. The 1950s and 1960s marked a period in which organized crime diversified its activities, extending beyond gambling and extortion to include narcotics trafficking, international smuggling, and large-scale financial crime. The syndicate forged connections with Cuban networks prior to the revolution, establishing routes through Havana that facilitated narcotics distribution into Florida and the eastern seaboard. When the revolution disrupted these routes, criminal groups shifted toward new supply lines across Mexico and Southeast Asia, adapting quickly to geopolitical changes. Their ability to reorganize demonstrated the complexity and flexibility that had developed since the early days of street-level violence. Furthermore, they began exerting influence over corporate sectors through stock manipulation, insurance fraud, loan sharking disguised as investment lending, and political corruption that ensured protection for their operations. The rise of federal oversight challenged the syndicate's dominance, particularly as investigative agencies modernized their strategies. The creation of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, stronger federal statutes, and innovative surveillance tactics introduced new obstacles. The Kefauver hearings of the early 1950s publicly exposed the extent of organized crime's influence, shifting public awareness and prompting legislative reform. Despite this pressure, the syndicate adapted by decentralizing power, reducing overt violence, and strengthening internal communication networks that allowed them to avoid unnecessary exposure. Many high-level leaders adopted quieter lifestyles, choosing to operate from the background while allowing intermediaries to manage street-level activities. This strategic evolution kept law enforcement at a distance and allowed criminal enterprises to flourish even under increasing scrutiny. By the 1970s, American organized crime had entered a period of profound transformation. The traditional families in New York, Chicago, and Detroit maintained their historic influence, yet the criminal environment had become more fragmented due to internal conflicts, generational divides, and competition from new groups. Emerging criminal organizations, such as motorcycle gangs, Latin American cartels, and independent drug distributors, began competing for territory and market share. The spread of narcotics, particularly heroin and later cocaine, reshaped the landscape by creating profit margins far greater than gambling or extortion ever produced. This shift weakened the syndicate's dominance, as their structured, conservative approach clashed with the chaotic, rapidly expanding narcotics networks that lacked the discipline of earlier criminal systems. Nevertheless, many syndicate families maintained influence by facilitating distribution, offering protection to smaller groups, or investing in the profits that these new enterprises generated. Throughout this period, the legacy of earlier figures such as Ziegler manifested not only in the physical infrastructure they had helped build but also in the methodology of criminal operations. The syndicate strategies for secrecy, financial manipulation, and hierarchical control became the blueprint for emerging criminal enterprises both in the United States and abroad. Although individual figures rose and fell, the structural impact of their work endured in the systems that outlived them. As federal pressure intensified near the end of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, major prosecutions targeted labor racketeering, casino skimming, and union corruption, leading to convictions that weakened several prominent families. Yet even in the face of diminishing power, the syndicate retained influence through decentralized operations, legitimate business fronts, and international partnerships that stretched across continents. By 1984, the American criminal underworld no longer resembled the world that Ziegler and his contemporaries had shaped during the early and mid-20th century. It had evolved into a complex ecosystem of competing entities, some deeply rooted in old traditions and others driven by new economic forces. Urban decay, the drug epidemic, political corruption, and economic instability created fertile ground for criminal adaptation, while law enforcement agencies struggled to keep pace with the shifting strategies of both traditional and emerging organizations. The influence of early pioneering figures persisted in the operational techniques, financial structures, and territorial strategies that defined the era, yet the world they had built had become something beyond their control, a sprawling, multi-layered network of alliances, conflicts, and enterprises that stretched from corporate boardrooms to devastated inner-city streets. It was a world shaped by decades of ambition, violence, innovation, betrayal, and shifting power, a world in which legacy and evolution coexisted, and in which the seeds planted by leaders of the early century continued to shape the criminal identity of America long after their deaths. By the early 1980s, the vast structure of American organized crime stood at an uneasy crossroads, shaped by decades of expansion yet threatened by the increasing weight of modern law enforcement, internal instability, and a rapidly shifting criminal economy. The syndicate, once defined by coordinated efficiency, secrecy, and a calculated balance of violence and negotiation, now faced pressures from both within and outside its traditional boundaries. The corporate-like precision that fueled its mid-century dominance began to erode under the influence of younger, less disciplined members and the explosive growth of narcotics markets that attracted independent operators unconcerned with the established codes. The older generation of crime figures, who had built their empires around gambling, extortion, union control, and financial manipulation, watched as the criminal world drifted into chaos fueled by unprecedented drug profits and the ruthless competition that accompanied them. This new landscape made the carefully constructed order of the past difficult to maintain. Federal agencies, equipped with advanced surveillance technologies, specialized task forces, undercover operations, and interdepartmental cooperation unknown in earlier decades, intensified their pressure on the syndicate. New laws allowed prosecutors to dismantle entire criminal networks through conspiracy charges and financial investigations that penetrated the complex layers of corporate fronts and hidden ownership structures. The introduction of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, enabled authorities to target leadership rather than just low-level operatives, resulting in a wave of indictments that exposed the inner workings of families long considered untouchable. The once protected flow of money from casinos, construction rackets, trucking industries, and union pension funds came under scrutiny as auditors, federal agents, and cooperating witnesses provided evidence that chipped away at the syndicate's most profitable strongholds. Las Vegas, which had served as a quiet pillar of organized crime for decades, became a battleground for federal intervention as new corporate owners and regulators challenged the quiet skimming operations that had enriched criminal families across the Midwest and East Coast. As law enforcement pressure intensified, internal fractures widened. Many older leaders faced imprisonment, exile, or declining health, leaving behind power vacuums that younger and more impulsive members sought to fill. The new generation lacked the strategic patience that had characterized the founding architects of the syndicate, resulting in disputes that were once settled through negotiation escalating into violence. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia saw a resurgence of internal conflicts that disrupted operations and drew unwanted attention. In New York, the gradual decline of traditional leadership paved the way for ambitious figures whose actions destabilized decades of carefully balanced relationships. In Chicago, long-standing alliances between West Side and North Side factions began to fray as narcotics profits overshadowed the old revenue structures. In Philadelphia, a destructive internal war erupted, driven by greed and mistrust, leaving bodies in the streets and weakening family cohesion. These conflicts revealed how far the criminal world had drifted from the disciplined, almost bureaucratic efficiency that once defined it. Meanwhile, emerging criminal organizations took advantage of the syndicate's vulnerability. Colombian cartels, expanding rapidly through the cocaine boom, established distribution networks that bypassed traditional intermediaries, undermining the syndicate's control over narcotics markets. Motorcycle gangs used their mobility, decentralized structure, and willingness to engage in direct violence to carve out territory across the country. Independent drug traffickers in Miami, Los Angeles, and New York built their own empires through sheer brutality and recklessness, operating outside the political and social constraints that had guided the old underworld. Street gangs, often motivated by survival rather than profit strategy, claimed neighborhoods that had once been under syndicate influence, turning urban centers into fiercely contested battlegrounds. This proliferation of competing groups diminished the syndicate's control and diluted its ability to enforce order across criminal markets. The shift in public perception also played a significant role in the syndicate's decline. While previous generations had operated behind a curtain of secrecy, the late 20th century brought unprecedented exposure through films, books, televised hearings, and journalistic investigations. The romanticized portrayals of organized crime attracted cultural fascination but also made its operations more visible and therefore more vulnerable. Law enforcement officials, driven by political pressure and public demand, made dismantling organized crime a national priority. This environment fostered aggressive investigations, high-profile prosecutions, and extensive media coverage that eroded the syndicate's ability to operate undetected. Informants and defectors, once rare, became increasingly common as individuals sought reduced sentences or protection from internal threats. Their testimonies provided invaluable insight into the financial structure, methods, and leadership of various families, contributing to the erosion of secrecy that had once protected the criminal elite. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the syndicate remained deeply embedded in American society. The systems it created, money laundering networks, labor racketeering structures, interstate gambling routes, and corporate infiltration methods, continued to influence criminal enterprises long after their creators were gone. Many of the financial strategies developed by mid-century figures became templates for modern criminal operations, and the infrastructure they built in cities like Las Vegas, Miami, Chicago, and New York remained central to local economies. The casinos that had once served as discrete income sources evolved into massive corporate entities, yet their history remained inseparable from the underworld forces that first developed them. The syndicate's influence could still be seen in political corruption cases, lingering union manipulation, and the hidden financial connections that shaped real estate and construction industries across the country. By 1984, the criminal empire built over nearly a century no longer possessed the cohesion or dominance it once enjoyed, but its impact remained undeniable. The early architects, men shaped by immigrant hardship and the violent streets of the early 20th century, had created systems that transcended their lifetimes. Their organizational methods, balancing secrecy, hierarchy, and profit-driven expansion, had defined American organized crime for decades. Although the forces of law, internal decline, and external competition had weakened the syndicate, they had not erased its legacy. Instead, they left behind a fractured yet enduring structure, a complex network of enterprises that continued to adapt in response to economic shifts and enforcement strategies. The world of 1984 was no longer the world of Ziegler, Lansky, Luciano, or the countless others who had shaped the early decades, but it remained a world largely built on the foundations they had laid. The transformation of the American underworld from 1900 to 1984 illustrated not only the adaptability and ambition of its figures but also the profound impact of social, economic, and political forces on criminal evolution. What began as fragmented gangs in immigrant neighborhoods grew into a national syndicate capable of infiltrating industries, cities, and institutions. Over time, this system fractured under its own weight, challenged by new criminal economies, internal instability, and unprecedented law enforcement aggression. Yet the imprint of those early decades, the violence, the innovation, the covert influence, and the relentless pursuit of profit, remained embedded in the identity of American crime. The legacy of the syndicate endured not as a coherent empire, but as a historical force that reshaped the nation's criminal landscape, leaving behind structures, methods, and myths that continued to shape the underworld long after its golden age had passed.